Hello, my name is Reese Norris, and today I will be talking about coral reef ecosystems and their ecological impacts, as well as their interactions within their communities. So, how do corals relate to ecology and the topics of communities, species diversity, ecosystems, and conservation? In today's presentation, I will be going over an introduction to corals and their morphology, community aspects of corals, species diversity within corals and how they contribute to the diversity of other species, ecosystem interactions in coral reefs, as well as conservation efforts and new genetic research. Introduction to corals. Corals are animals with bodies made of polyps. These polyps completely cover a skeleton made of calcium carbonate, which are the hard corals, or limestone. Different corals are made of different materials. Some are even made of silica. Corals are classified as soft or hard corals depending on their skeleton. Soft corals are made of single polyps that grow to form colonies. These corals move with the waves and tide, and that is how they collect their food through suspension feeding and collecting the food particles within the water. Hard corals are what make up most of a reef. In order to feed themselves, they use tentacles to move towards food as they cannot move with water like soft corals can. These hard corals are also colonies but are bound to their calcium carbonate skeletons. Coral phenotype and morphology. So, what gives corals their color? A coral's colorful appearance is caused by their symbiotic relationships with photosynthetic algae, which are plant cells, called zooxanthellae. So in this picture on the left, we can see a coral that has a green appearance due to the zooxanthellae living inside the coral polyps, and then we can see some red sea anemones living off of that coral. And in the left, we can see a piperfish that is living within this coral ecosystem. So, do all corals have the same zooxanthellae species living inside their polyps? With new genetic testing techniques, recent studies have found that there are linkages between coral performance and coral genetics. Bombs has found that species that show site adaptation and species that harbor both generalist and specialist genotypes are essential to understanding coral symbiosis and their adaptations. Understanding these adaptations will allow scientists to base conservation efforts on coral life history strategies. In addition, corals are very picky animals. They need just the right conditions in order to survive and thrive. This leads to there being many different distributions of corals within the same reef depending on sunlight intensity and the depth of the reef. Ecotypes are common within coral species due to their specific needs and their relationships with the algae symbionts that are also equipped with site-specific adaptations. These coral ecotypes are corals that have distinct form and occupy a particular reef habitat. Coral reef formations and types of coral reefs. Coral reefs get their structure when free-swimming coral larvae attach themselves to existing rocks and other structures underwater. Once the corals attach themselves, they begin to grow and encase more hard structures, forming a coral reef. Corals have three major characteristic structures, and we will go over these three structures and explain them and show them later. When corals, such as stony corals, uptake algal byproducts from photosynthesis, they then have the materials to form and create calcium carbonate. The calcium carbonate then forms the skeleton that lies underneath the coral polyps. As the coral polyps expand onto new surfaces, they excrete the calcium carbonate skeleton simultaneously.
There are three different types of coral reefs, and we will first start off with the fringing coral reef. Fringing coral reefs are the most common type. They border a shoreline directly, and they often surround islands acting as a border. One of the largest fringing reefs is the Ningaloo Reef, found on the western coast of Australia. This reef is right at the shore, making it popular for ecotourism.
So here we have a NASA image that was taken using a Landsat satellite, and here we can see the Ningaloo fringing coral reef. Right along here, we can see that all of this reef is going to be right along the shoreline. That provides a lot of protection for the shore and the animals living there, and it's very close to where the land would be, providing it a lot of ecotourism. The second type of coral reef are going to be the barrier reefs, and barrier reefs also border the shorelines, but they have further distance between the shore and the reef formation than a fringing reef would. Barrier reefs are removed from the landmass by a lagoon of open, deep water. And the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is the largest coral reef system in the world. It is considered to be a diversity hotspot with over 900 islands and one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. So this image is from NASA's Landsat 7 satellite, and it's going to give us an amazing aerial view of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And here we can see that the Barrier Reef is much farther away than the Ningaloo Fringing Reef was, and it has a lot more distance, and there are hundreds of different coral reefs making a huge ecosystem here in Australia. And this reef stands as the largest structure made by living organisms on Earth. The third and final type of coral reef are going to be the atoll reefs. Atoll reefs, as stated by NOAA, occur when a fringing reef forms around a volcanic island that has sunk completely below sea level while the coral continues to go upward. Atoll reefs are typically circular or oval and have a central lagoon that can be accessed by gaps between the reef platform. Here we have the Matava Atoll. So this is a satellite image found of the Matava Atoll located in French Polynesia. In here we can see the central lagoon, and the only exit through the lagoon is going to be right here. And then we have atoll formation. So first, an underwater volcano pierces the surface of the ocean. Then a coral reef forms around the volcanic island. Fringing reefs surrounds the subsiding sinking island, and then a barrier reef protects the lagoon as the island completely sinks. So here we are going to be talking about coral community interactions and the mesophotic coral ecosystem. So research has been done by Kong that poses some answers that have helped with the understanding of corals and their dynamic community interactions. In this research, they tested the global degradation of shallow water species and mesophotic coral ecosystems. Mesophotic coral reef ecosystems have a high variance in depth, and that is why they're considered mesophotic, because all of the zooanthellae have different photosynthetic needs. Despite more awareness and research being done, MCES are only understood on the most basic level. Information on taxonomic compositions, depth range, habitat preference, and abundance of taxa is limited as it is understudied. Mesophotic coral ecosystems are found in tropical waters with ranging depths between 100 to about 500 feet. They are light dependent and need warm waters to grow. Until recently, there was no way of studying these ecosystems effectively, but with new technology development, there is more research happening and new emerging evidence coming out. There have been some major findings coming from Khan's community research and the mesophotic coral reef ecosystems. After his research, Kong had recorded that in the Caribbean and in the Indo-Pacific, it has been found that many species that typically dominate the communities of shallow water corals are not found in mesophotic coral reef ecosystems. In addition, herbivores are scarce in these mesophotic ecosystems, and it's been hypothesized that that is due to limited habitat complexity at depth. And then, as quoted, changes in the dominant photosynthetic taxa with depth suggest adaptation and specialization to depth. So here we can see that these corals are well adapted to these differences in shallow water corals versus mesophotic coral ecosystems. Some major findings from Kong's research include that coral growth and biodiversity of their reefs have been disturbed heavily by both direct and indirect human interactions. As stated within Kong's research, in recent years, the integrity and health of coral reef ecosystems are increasingly threatened by numerous anthropogenic stresses, including habitat alteration, terrigenous sources of pollution, resource extraction, and climate change. It has also been found that the fish biodiversity is directly linked to the corals growing in these mesophotic coral ecosystems. Conclusions, examples, and other takeaways from Khan's research. In the Caribbean, Khan found that the composition and numerical dominance of fish species associated with mesophotic habitats at sites across the Caribbean varies across the same depth gradient as the sessile benthic fauna. Due to this relationship between the fish species and the benthic fauna, as waters get deeper and the reefs have lower temperatures and less sunlight, the coral species whose algae symbionts are not suitable for low temperatures and darker water are less numerous. For the community to have a maximum species diversity, there needs to be an abundance of live corals. The benthic fauna rely on the corals to survive. It was found that the fish species richness correlates strongly with live coral cover. Coral species and their corresponding algae in reef communities. As the reef varies in water depth, there are changes seen in dominant photosynthetic taxa. This suggests that species living in mesophotic reefs are adapting in ways that shallow water corals have not. For mesophotic zooanthellae, coral adaptations to low light and extreme depths may include flattened morphologies to maximize light capture, monolayered zooanthellae packaging to reduce self-shading, and in some cases, specialized zooanthellae. This highlights the importance of corals and their interactions with algae. The algae has huge impacts on fish biodiversity, as does coral abundance. Fish rely on the corals to hide from prey, and different species of fish use corals of different sizes, shapes, and depths in order to survive. So having a lot of different kinds of coral is essential to accommodating all the different types of life that they support. Within the coral ecosystem, there needs to be biodiversity between corals, algae, and fish in order to ensure health within the community. Coral reef bleaching due to anthropogenic disturbances. All over the world, coral reef bleaching has become a disastrous problem seen within the coral reefs. This coral bleaching occurs when the zooanthellae leave the coral polyps as they become stressed. If corals become stressed due to factors such as high temperature and acidic water, they will expel their algal cells. Without the algae, what can be seen is the calcium carbonate skeleton. Essentially, the coral polyps without their symbionts leave the reefs looking ghostly and bare. In this image from the National Ocean Service, on the left, we can see a stony coral that has all of its zooanthellae, which allows this coral to have color, and that will also allow this coral to expand and grow and flourish onto other hard surfaces. On the right, this coral has no zooanthellae within its polyps, so it's merely just the calcium carbonate skeleton. This coral's polyps will likely die, and thus will do nothing for the coral reef. The formation between the algal cells and the coral polyps are dependent on one another. If the corals become stressed and expel their algae, the corals have no means to thrive. The corals depend on the algae for their photosynthetic products that allow the polyps to undergo cellular respiration. This represents a mutualistic relationship that acts as a keystone species for all reef organisms. In this graphic from NOAA, we can see that this represents the zooanthellae, so that is going to be the algal symbiont of the coral polyp. Here we can see the zooanthellae takes in products from the coral stomach, right here, and then the zooanthellae will expel and provide for the coral to undergo cellular respiration. So this cycle is essential to coral production, and without it, the coral reef has no way to grow or replenish itself and is just going to look like this.
Coral reef conservation efforts. In Summerlin's Key, Florida, the Moat Marine Laboratory and Aquarium that's based in Sarasota has been able to restore over 1,300 corals. The Moat Lab aims to educate locals and tourists on the importance of Florida's coral reefs and aims to gain their support for its restoration. One of the most important things that can be done for coral conservation and other conservation efforts is to get the public involved and engaged. With their support and donations, the labs can grow corals and reintroduce them onto natural and man-made reefs. With all of the research being done by Moat, it has been found that coral reefs are declining due to many anthropogenic reasons such as water acidification, coral disease, pollution, overfishing, and other stressors in Summerland, Florida. With genetic technology advancing, Moat scientists such as Dr. Aaron Moeller have been able to use coral genotypes to optimize coral restoration. By prioritizing native genetic varieties and those able to be more resistant to stressors such as acidification and higher temperature waters, they have been able to successfully restore thousands of corals in Summerland Key, Florida. The Elizabeth Moore International Center for Coral Reef Research and Restoration, operated by Moat, has been able to revolutionize coral restoration and set standards that will be used globally to save coral reef systems. With these advances, there is more hope than ever that it is not too late to save our reefs.
So this video is going to be from Moat Marine's Aquarium and their 2020 coral spawning breakthrough. Coral restoration is key to our marine's ecosystem, health, and ecology. Coral reef spawning provides an abundant food source for many reef-dwelling organisms. The algae rely on the coral polyps for necessary byproducts of cellular respiration to carry out photosynthesis. Creatures rely on corals for shelter, and the organisms that take shelter in the corals provide larger organisms such as sea turtles with shell cleaning and natural dentistry. Many countries rely on ecotourism, and with coral reefs declining, it will have huge impacts on these countries' economies. The fishing industry and those relying on it will also be impacted, and those species reliant on the reefs will decline along with the corals. There needs to be a balance within the marine ecosystem, and with the foundational and keystone species that corals and their symbionts provide the ocean, we will likely see drastic declines in biodiversity and ultimately imbalance across the entire ocean with the falling of the coral reefs. Corals act as foundational species, as they are essential to the formation and structure of our reefs and other marine ecosystems. The algae and polyps work together and act as keystone species. Corals are one of the primary fundamental interactions of marine ecosystems, and without their influence and dynamics with other species, the oceans would collapse. Corals are the primary species that regulate bottom-up control within their ecosystems. The very small species that corals are drive all community dynamics in the ocean. We all have a part to play in saving our coral reefs and its biodiversity. But putting more resources towards researching coral species life histories, genetics, site adaptations, and relationships with algae scientists will be able to make specific conservation efforts to the most at-risk coral species. One of the most important things the public can do is support these scientists through volunteering, funding, and visiting their coral programs. With efforts such as using reef-safe sunscreens, participating in beach and coastal cleanups, and keeping fertilizer and other contaminants out of the ocean, we can help support coral conservation. Not only is coral conservation necessary for the marine species that rely on it, but it's also essential to those who rely on the ocean for food, work, ecotourism, and want to have a healthy planet for as long as possible. It has been suggested that a large portion of human health drugs are being synthesized reliant on the ocean for development and materials. By saving our coral reefs, we can start setting expectations for conservation efforts that can expand globally. Thanks to scientists at institutions such as MELT and all those yet to come, there is hope that we can still have coral reefs for many generations to enjoy and protect. So this is my references page and all of my citations that I used to get this research, including the photo references. And if you have any comments or opinions or would like to say anything, please reply to my presentation and I'll get back to you. Thank you.